TakeTalk Pics.com. I am Rob Kruger, and this is episode 57 with our Fundamental Fridays. We're going to be kicking this off, and basically what I want to do for the Fundamental Fridays is bring us back to the basics, walk us through one thing at a time, talking about the different settings on your camera, and we're going to eventually get into gear and ways of shooting. It's just going to take us one after another, as if I'm teaching a course here, from beginner to intermediate all the way to advanced, and I have the next 32 weeks in my notes kind of planned out of what I'm going to be talking about. So I got really excited when I decided to do this and change things over from the interview on Fridays to having the Fundamental Fridays. I'm super excited, and I hope that you, Photo World, will follow along and be a part of this from start to finish, because I've been looking through my notes and things that I've been setting up, and I believe fully that there are things in here that pros can learn something they may not have heard before, or they can have a way of contributing to the conversation in the fact that I might say something that could resonate with many, but there are a few out there who aren't getting it quite yet, and that's okay. Go ahead and comment and let us know, because those other pros out there who are listening to TakeTalkPics.com and tuning into the podcast, hanging out on the webinars, going to the workshops, because we're doing everything now, right? And for those pros listening, they can come and help you out too. And I want this to be a network. I want this to be a community of people joining together and talking photography, whether it be the business where this whole Take and Talk Pics show started and continues with our Wednesday interviews, or if it's about just getting the settings down and learning your camera and learning your gear, and then how to use it a little bit better and then improve. So that way we don't have plateaus in our industry, we don't have plateaus in our business. We can keep growing and learning, whether we're helping others or being helped by others. There's always room to grow. Let's get started, Photo World. Here we go. So here we go, Photo World. We are going to start off our Fundamental Fridays with one of our main settings. It's shutter speed. All right, here we go. What is shutter speed? What do we have to deal with when we're talking about shutter speed? What does it really mean? Well, there's a ton of definitions out there, but they all basically result in the same idea and the same kind of thing. Shutter speed, or exposure time, is the length of time a camera's shutter is open when taking a photograph. The amount of light that reaches the film or image sensor is proportional to the exposure time. Okay, so what is shutter speed? Well, in short, shutter speed is the duration. All right, it is a length of time, and we measure it in time. It's actually seconds or fractions of seconds. We have cameras that will go from 30 seconds having or doubling in their time duration, more or less, all the way up to 1/8,000th of a second. Now, I have it bracketed out from 1 second to 1/8,000th of a second, and I think there's 2 points I want to kind of pull out of here and make it known so you understand how this works. First of all, before I get into those 2 points that we need to pull out of here and be familiar with, because it's really just a memory game when it comes to some of these numbers, these are listed in full stops. So a full stop will equal half or double the amount of light reaching the image sensor or film space. So if we go from a quarter second, 1/4, 1/4 of a second, to 1/8 of a second, we are cutting the time in half, and we actually have half the amount of the image being exposed, or half the amount of light reaching the sensor. It makes sense. We're doubling the time, therefore cutting the time available for light. So when we get into these few things in these little steps, they do go half and double for the most part. There's a few hiccups here. When we go from 1/4 to 1/8, that makes sense. We go to 1/15. What happened, right? It should be 1/16th in our minds, but if you start thinking ahead, 16th, 32, 64, 128, it could get confusing when we get to those higher shutter speeds. So it was an easy decision to say 1/8 to 1/15th of a second. Now we can kind of level out for a little bit, 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second. And we kind of want to bring it back again. We have another hiccup here. So 125th of a second, 1/125th. It makes it a little bit easier when we move forward here with 1/250th of a second, 1/500th, 1,000th, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000. And over time, you just get familiar with these. You kind of kick off the 1 in the beginning there, and you just stick to the denominator and kind of say, oh, it's a quarter, or 8, 15. I'm at 250. Yeah, we all know it's ending up being 1/250th of a second, but that's a little bit too long-winded to say anything. Like I said earlier, we can go from a 30-second time frame up to 1/8,000th of a second, and that varies from camera to camera. A lot of prosumer cameras or beginner cameras are in the 2,000 to 1/4,000th of a second as the high range, and then the low end is still about that 30-second space. Mirrorless cameras I've been finding are doing about a full minute with their long side of exposure time or shutter speed. So I think it's really nice for mirrorless cameras that they offer that. I think it'd be wonderful if Nikon, Canon, Sony, Olympus, everybody with the DSLRs who are putting them out there would kind of give us that full minute shutter speed and then offer what we call bulb mode. And that is offered on most digital cameras, especially the SLRs these days. Bulb mode just means it's going to be wide open. You're going to leave it open for the amount of time you see fit. So there are different tools, different shutter release cables that can be plugged into your camera, and you can have the bulb mode. So your exposure time could be 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 4 hours. It could be a huge wide range of anything you really want. It's, in theory, it is as long as you want it to be open. The end, and then you decide when it closes. So like I said, there are different tools that you can bring to your camera and implement them so that way it can be timed for you, or you can do it manually and time it yourself. But there are options to go virtually just about anywhere with this, and the 1/8,000th of a second is kind of our limit at today's technology. But there are some tricks around it where you can be cheating the system with other tools in place. And we'll get there down the line, Photo World. I promise. It's just going to take a few weeks before we talk about that stuff because I don't want to get too technical here. I want to get into the basics. And here we go with shutter speed, continuing on. And the shutter is actually a mechanism. It's referred to as the shutter curtain. It is two different pieces following one after another. And it kind of looks something like this. It's different from camera to camera. But as you'll see in that little window area where there's little lines going across, those are the shutters, okay? And one shutter will go down or side to side. It depends on the camera or the make of it. And the other will follow. And if there is a half-second exposure time or shutter speed, then it will open a half second and then it will close just following that. And it's pretty darn close to fitting in that. It's got a little technical change as it's moving. But when we start looking at 100th of a second, which is just about, it's a third stop below that 1/125th of a second, we start to see them moving together. So one will fall as it opens, and before it reaches the bottom, the top one will start coming down to close it off. So when you start thinking about it, and let me speed up the process for you at like a 500th of a second, when the curtain is coming down and it's about halfway, the top one will start to come down, and it looks like a little strip is only being shown on the sensor or film behind it, and then it will close off. And when you want to get your mind wrapped around what that means and how it works, think of a scanner. Your printer will have a scanner on it, and it has that little light bar that moves across, and it's actually taking a picture and scanning and photographing the document or whatever you're scanning. And it's the same thing with a shutter. It's kind of leaving a gap open, exposing your film or digital sensor to the light passing through the lens and therefore the reflected scene coming at you. That's how a picture's made. And it's just a really cool mechanism, and it took so many years for them to finally get to a shutter curtain. It used to be low sensitivity film, and you have to take off the cap, let it expose, close the camera, and be done. That was your shutter. It was you. But now we're in a totally different age. In our digital world here, we're all fast-paced, going an 8,000th of a second. Just like that speed, we should move along here. So what are the uses of shutter speed? There's a lot of them, and just a few to pull out. You can help control sharpness. You can stop the motion of your image, or you can blur the motion intentionally. These are just different tricks that you can use to create a feeling for your images. You can go ahead and use it for panning, which is a whole nother realm and kind of difficult to master, but we'll get there. And then long exposure, making sure it works with your flash sync speed, because there are limitations there when you're using flash. And then high speed photography. There are ways to make that work to your advantage. And it's a really cool trick. Like I said earlier, we'll get there. It's so awesome. I'm just excited. Fast shutter all the way. Here we go. So what fast shutter does is it freezes motion in time. It captures a person in that space, or a scene or element in that space, the way it looked at that split second. This ballerina here on the right, she could not jump up, hold this pose, and exist in that space for more than the 500th of a second that it took to photograph her. on the safe side, a 2/50th of a second because they're using flash. I don't know. I don't know the full settings of this image, but I do know that people can't exist in that space like that. So photography offers us the potential to have something that we can't even fathom in existence. We're just so used to pictures, we don't think about it that way, but it's a really cool phenomenon that photography gives us this different thing we wouldn't be able to see otherwise, because she would pass through that in our eyes when we're watching a dancer on stage. Same with this, punching the water here and the water splashing all over. It's cool that the water freezes there like that. It looks like ice, but we know it's water because we're used to pictures. Slow shutter speed is quite the opposite. You can use it to blur images. People use it for waterfalls all the time, but I liked this one of the pool balls here being shot all over the place. And you can even see the guy is a little bit blurry, but the table is in focus. The room is in focus because nothing's moving, including the camera. But the guy who's, playing the pool there, he's moving a little bit, so he's going to be blurry. The balls are moving everywhere, so they're going to be blurry. And same with the water down below. It's water passing over these falls here, and it's being recorded, so it creates that streak. Everything else is in focus because it's not moving much or at all, especially with those rocks on the right. So it gives us a really cool, majestic, silky look. And slow shutter speed is just a great tool to have some interesting effects. So what does all this mean, really? Well, slow shutter speed, fast shutter speed, the duration of time will affect how an image looks. So if we look at the spout coming out here with the faucet, we see 5 seconds, it's just a nice stream of water, kind of what we are used to seeing just if we turn on the water in our sink. And if you go to 1 over 1600, that's a weird number, but we're just shy of that 2000 mark, I guess. So let's say 1 over 2000, it will freeze those droplets in their place, and we kind of have a nice different look to the thing if you're comparing those corners to one another. The half a second kind of looks similar to the 5 seconds. The 1 over 100 kind of looks similar to the half second. But, you can start to see it slowly changes till you get to that super fast shutter speed where it's frozen in time. Same with this pinwheel below. We're going to assume that the pinwheel is spinning super fast like it appears the one on the right. For all we know, they could have different speeds and gotten around this just for the effect and making it look this way. But for our purposes, this pinwheel is moving really crazy fast. Crazy fast in the wind, and the studio fan, the hair fan's going crazy. And they photograph it really fast shutter speed with the one on the left there, just freezing it in time. All the way to the right there, they're letting it, bleed a little bit on the sensor, letting the image blend together as it's being captured because of the duration of time. It's smearing because the thing is in motion. So panning is a really cool tool. And with wait a second. Not that panning. Never mind. Here we go. So panning is a cool tool. And with panning, you follow your subject as they're passing through space of a scene, right? So what we do is we follow along, we capture them, and continue to follow as we capture. All right? So that way they stay in focus for the most part. We can see the wheels spinning and the feet are still moving, but the upper body of this bicyclist is tack sharp. And the background is just this blurry smear because you're following along. You're creating that motion blur with your camera. Same with the kid down below. The exact same thing, just the other direction. You're following along this kid. He's pretty darn sharp, and then everything else is really blurry because you're creating that as you move through the image, following along from start to finish. Shoot through your panning shots. So as you're photographing a car, zipping by, make sure you have a little distance between you because the closer you are, the harder it is. But make sure you have that distance and, follow along, click, release that shutter, keep following, and then when the image is over, continue to follow so that way you know you got it. You can kind of set the pace so you are tracking that subject matter in frame the same way they're moving through it. So shutter speed is just 1/3 of our exposure, all right? We have a few options here, ISO, and it's not ISO. I need to please correct those out there who consider it to be called ISO. You are incorrect. It is ISO. It's an acronym for International Standardization Organization. They decided what it means and what we use it for, and it's ISO. It's kind of just something I'm really picky about. I'm really tired of hearing ISO from people because it's totally incorrect. Aperture. This is the opening in the lens. We'll get there next week. Shutter speed is what we're talking about today, but these three work together to create your exposure for an image. So a lot of questions that go with shutter speed is, why is shutter speed listed in fractions? Again, it's the duration of time and fractions of time, literally in seconds, fractions of seconds. So does shutter control sharpness? The short answer is yes. However, you can use it to not be sharp on purpose, or there are other things like flash, which we'll get to in a few weeks, that can control the sharpness for you regardless of your shutter speed. But the short answer, shutter does control sharpness in some regard. Would the shutter speed vary based on the subject distance? Now, I don't remember who brought that to my attention, but it seemed like a lot of people had that question once it came up. They were really confused if that mattered, that if your subject distance from your camera would affect the need for a certain shutter speed. And realistically, no, not really. I mean, if we're going to do panning and we're standing right on the side of the road and getting cars right in that lane next to us, sure, it's just going to be you having the difficult problem, not the shutter speed. Realistically, for the majority of cases out there, no, this isn't going to be a big deal. It's not going to affect you very much at all. So some guidelines for shutter speed. These are not things you have to take with you and stick to it to a T, but have the shutter speed base number, the denominator, be greater than your focal length. Right? If you have a lens zoomed in to 55 millimeters, then you would want to have a shutter speed of at least 1/60th of a second, and this will prevent blur caused by camera shake. So we're talking about handheld photography here. You would like to have your shutter speed denominator numerically exceed your focal length millimeters. All right, so 55 millimeters that you're zoomed in on your 18 to 55 lens, then you'll want to be at least 1/60th of a second for handheld photography to make sure it's going to be sharp. It's not a rule, but it does help you consider what your settings should be at so you can adjust your shutter speed with some safety in mind. Then you can change up your aperture and ISO to adjust for the actual exposure. So to freeze motion of a subject, aim for a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second or faster. Now, why 2/50th? The majority of cameras, DSLRs out there, are going to be at the 200th or 250th range for their flash sync. And that is the reason. If you do 100th of a second, there's still potential for some blur if somebody's jumping in the air and gravity's pulling them down, right? And that 2/50th of a second is your flash sync speed on the majority of cameras out there, or 200th. But that's about where you want to be to make sure you're going to freeze a subject in time sharply. To cause blurring of a subject, aim to have a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second or slower. All right, so if you're at a 30th of a second and you're using that 55 millimeters, you could have some camera shake, right? It's totally potential, but you can probably hold it a little bit better than your subject moving if you want there to be blur on purpose. So it's safe to say a 30th of a second is a good time frame for you to photograph a blurry subject. Now, if you want to take the factor of handheld out of it, put it on a tripod. Toss it on there, and that 30th of a second of anybody running by is going to be blurry, but the scene, the trees and the ground and the buildings around you are going to be sharp and remain in focus. So that 30th of a second or slower is good for blurring of a subject. The rules of shutter speed are made to be broken. When you understand aperture and ISO, you will find ways to skew the rules of shutter speed and create compelling photographs. So what I'm getting at with that little last statement is these are good guidelines. These may be some good rules to follow just to make sure you're in a good place for keeping camera shake out of the picture, for freezing motion with a 2/50th of a second or faster, for blurring some motion there on some of your subject matter at a 30th of a second or slower. But you can break these rules and bend them a little bit when you start to understand the other settings and use them in your favor to create and make great pictures. Well, Photo World, thank you for stopping by. That is the first Fundamental Fridays. I'm going to see you next week for our next Fundamental Fridays, where we start talking about aperture and start to blend these two together and see what we can do in beginning to build our exposure understanding. Thank you and happy shooting. Hey Photo World, if you were unable to attend last Wednesday's webinar, there's actually another one coming up on August 19th. Be sure to go to takeandtalkpics.com, hit the webinar tab, and sign up today. We have to improve our skills. It's just the nature of the beast. We cannot stay stagnant or else we'll be left behind in the dust of the competition. Start with a 10-day free trial to lynda.com. Head over to the affiliates page on Take Talk Pics and start improving your skills today. Takeandtalkpics.com. Thank you again for joining us today, and we really appreciate you stopping by. Make sure you share this with your friends and photo family out there. We'll see you next time. This is Rob Kruger. Happy shooting.